Alina Marsh's hands were shaking before she even reached the gate. The letter in her bag had arrived 3 days earlier, sealed with a wax stamp she did not recognize, written in a tone that left no room for questions. Duke Alexander Wren requests your presence at Wren Manor. Monday, 9 in the morning. Do not be late. She had read it 7 times, searching for a hidden explanation, but there was none. She did not know the Duke. She had never met him, never worked for his company, never crossed paths with anyone in his world. Her world was spreadsheets, overdue invoices, and a small family business that was one bad month away from closing its doors forever. Now she stood at the iron gates of Wren Manor, and her breath came out in short, uneven clouds in the cold morning air. A guard in a dark coat checked her name against a list, nodded once, and waved her through without a word. The gravel path crunched under her shoes as she walked toward the enormous stone house. It looked less like a home and more like something out of an old painting, tall windows, dark ivy climbing the walls, the kind of place built to remind visitors exactly how small they were. Alina tightened her coat around herself and kept walking. Turning back was not an option. Her family needed this, whatever this turned out to be. A woman in a gray uniform met her at the door and led her through a long hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced men, who all seemed to share the same sharp jaw and cold eyes. Alina guessed they were Wren ancestors, generations of men who had built and guarded this empire long before she was born. At the end of the hallway, the woman stopped in front of a heavy wooden door and knocked twice. "Come in," a deep voice answered. The woman opened the door, gestured for Alina to enter, and disappeared without another word, leaving her alone. The study was large, filled with dark wood shelves and the smell of old paper. A fire burned quietly in the corner. Behind a wide desk sat a man Alina recognized instantly from magazine covers and business articles, though none of those photographs had prepared her for the sheer presence of him in person. Duke Alexander Wren did not stand when she entered. He did not smile, did not offer a greeting. He simply studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes moving over her like he was reading a report rather than looking at a person. "Sit," he said. It was not a request. Alina sat in the chair across from his desk, her spine straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. She had faced difficult clients before, impatient bank managers, landlords threatening to lock her family out of their small office. She told herself this was no different, just another person who wanted something from her or wanted to give her something with strings attached. "You're wondering why you're here," Alexander said. It was not a question either. "Yes," Alina admitted. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I don't know anyone in your circle, Your Grace. I run a small accounting firm with my father. I don't understand what business we could possibly have." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she could not read. "Your father's business," he said slowly, "is nearly 200,000 in debt. 3 suppliers have already threatened legal action. Your family home is 1 missed payment away from the bank taking it. Should I continue?" Alina felt the blood drain from her face. She had told no one outside her immediate family about the extent of their troubles. Not even her closest friends knew the full truth. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I make it my business to know things," Alexander said simply. "It is how I survive in a world full of people who would take advantage of any weakness they find in me." Alina's jaw tightened. She did not like being reminded of her family's weakness, especially not by a stranger who clearly held all the power in this conversation. But she said nothing, waiting for him to continue, because she suspected he had not summoned her here simply to recite her financial history. "I have a problem," Alexander said, standing now and walking toward the window. The morning light outlined his tall frame against the gray sky outside. "My grandfather's will contains a clause. In order to inherit full control of the Wren estate and the company that carries our name, I must be married before my 35th birthday. That birthday is in 6 weeks." Alina blinked. "I still don't see what that has to do with me." Alexander turned to face her fully now. "I need a wife. not a real one, a marriage in name only on paper long enough to satisfy the terms of the will. In exchange, I will pay off every debt your family carries. I will make sure your father's business survives. Your family will never worry about money again. For a long moment, Alina simply stared at him, certain she had misheard. You want me to marry you, she said slowly, as a business transaction. Yes. And in exchange, you'll save my family's company. Yes. Alina studied his face, searching for some sign that this was a joke, some crack in his composure that would tell her he was testing her, or that there was some other explanation. But Alexander Wren's expression remained perfectly still, perfectly certain, like a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. Why me? She finally asked. You could choose anyone, someone from your own world, someone who actually wants this kind of arrangement. Because you need something from me, which means you have no interest in staying married to me longer than necessary, Alexander said. And because you have no connections to my world, no interest in my money beyond what I've already offered, and no reason to complicate this with feelings. It is simple, clean, exactly what I need. Something about the way he said feelings, like it was a problem to be avoided, made Alina's chest tighten. She thought of her father, who had not slept properly in months, pacing their small kitchen at night with calculators and unpaid bills spread across the table. She thought of her mother's worried eyes, the weight she carried trying to hold their family together. And she thought about pride, and how little it mattered when weighed against her family's survival. Alexander walked back to his desk and pulled a folder from the drawer. He opened it and slid a thick document across the polished wood toward her. This is the agreement, he said. It outlines everything. The terms of the marriage, the length of time required, the financial arrangements for your family, and what happens once the will's conditions are satisfied. Read it carefully. Alina picked up the document with hands that had finally stopped shaking. She read through the pages methodically, the way she read every contract, every clause, checking for hidden traps the way her father had taught her. The terms were exactly as he described. A marriage lasting no less than 1 year. Complete financial relief for her family, transferred immediately upon signing. Separate lives, separate rooms, no expectation of anything beyond appearances at required public events. At the bottom of the final page was a line for her signature, waiting. Alexander watched her the entire time, his arms crossed, clearly expecting hesitation, perhaps tears, perhaps a demand for more money or questions about whether she would fall for him, the way he had seen in other women who circled men of his status hoping for exactly that kind of arrangement. He was prepared for all of it. He was not prepared for what happened next. Alina set the document down, picked up the pen resting beside it, and without another question, without another moment of hesitation, she signed her name at the bottom of the page. Then she placed the pen down gently and looked up at him, her expression calm, steady, unreadable. Sign and leave, Alexander had told his assistant earlier that morning, rehearsing the words he planned to say to her, expecting to watch her crumble under the weight of his command, expecting resistance he would need to overcome. He had prepared arguments. He had prepared a higher offer in case she refused the first one. He had prepared everything except this. Alina stood, smoothed the front of her coat, and looked him directly in the eye. Is there anything else, Your Grace? She asked, or am I free to go? For the first time in longer than he could remember, Duke Alexander Wren found himself with absolutely nothing to say. He simply stared at her. This quiet, composed woman who had just signed away a year of her life without so much as a flinch, who had looked him in the eye and asked to leave as though she were the one in control of the room. You may go, he finally managed, his voice quieter than before. Alina nodded once, turned and walked toward the door. Her hand rested on the handle for a brief moment before she paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. Thank you for helping my family, she said simply, and then she was gone, leaving him standing alone in his study, the folder still open on his desk, her signature staring back at him like a question he did not yet know how to answer. Outside, Elena walked back down the gravel path toward the gate, her heart pounding, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She had walked into that house one person and walked out another, bound now to a stranger, to a life she had never imagined for herself. But her family was safe. That was all that mattered. She did not look back at the manor as she left, though somewhere behind one of those tall windows, Alexander Wren stood watching her go, more unsettled by her calm departure than he had been by anything else in years. He had expected to break her resistance. Instead, she had walked away without giving him the chance to see if she had any resistance to break at all, and that unanswered question would follow him long after she disappeared from view. The car arrived at Elena's house 2 days later, sleek and black, far too polished for the narrow street where she had grown up. Neighbors peeked through curtains as the driver stepped out and opened the rear door, waiting patiently while Elena carried out the last of her bags herself, refusing every offer of help. Her mother stood on the porch, her eyes red from crying the night before, though she tried to hide it now behind a brave smile. Her father gripped Elena's shoulders with both hands, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to do this," he said for the 10th time that morning. "We will find another way." "There is no other way, Dad," Elena said gently. "And it's only for a year. Then everything goes back to normal and the business is safe. That's what matters." He pulled her into a tight hug, and for a moment Elena let herself feel the fear she had been hiding since she signed that contract. Then she stepped back, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the car before her resolve could crack any further. The drive to Wren Manor took nearly an hour, winding through hills and past gates that grew grander the closer they came to the estate. Elena watched the scenery pass in silence, her mind circling the same question over and over. What had she actually agreed to? When the car finally stopped in the wide stone courtyard, a small group of staff members had already gathered near the entrance, standing in a neat line like soldiers waiting for inspection. At the front of the group stood a tall woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp, assessing eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret, the head housekeeper, and gave Elena a brief, formal welcome that felt more like a warning than a greeting. "His Grace is occupied with business matters today," Margaret said, leading Elena through the grand entrance hall. "He asked that you be shown to your rooms and given a tour of the parts of the house relevant to your daily life." Elena nodded, trying to absorb the sheer size of the place as they walked. Marble floors stretched in every direction. Chandeliers hung from ceilings so high she had to tilt her head back to see them properly, and every hallway seemed to lead to another hallway just as grand as the last. As they walked, she noticed the staff watching her from doorways and corners, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. She caught fragments of whispered conversation as she passed. "That's her. The one from the newspapers this morning. I heard she comes from nothing, no family name at all. Wonder how long this one lasts." Elena kept her chin up and her pace steady, refusing to let the whispers show on her face, though each comment landed like a small stone against her chest. She had known this would not be easy. She had not expected it to start on her very first hour in the house. Margaret led her to a wing on the second floor. Far from what she explained was the Duke's private quarters. The room assigned to Elena was larger than her entire childhood bedroom back home, decorated in soft blues and creams, with a window that overlooked a garden stretching toward a distant line of trees. "Your belongings will be brought up shortly," Margaret said, standing stiffly near the door. "Dinner is served at 7 in the main dining room. His Grace expects punctuality." "Will he be joining me?" Elena asked, though she was not sure why the question mattered to her. Margaret's expression flickered, something close to surprise crossing her sharp features before she smoothed it away. "His Grace rarely dines with guests," she said carefully. "I would not expect his company if I were you." The words were meant as simple information, but Elena heard something else beneath them, a quiet suggestion that she should not expect anything at all from this arrangement beyond what had been written on paper. That evening, Elena sat alone at one end of an enormous dining table designed to seat 20 people, eating a meal prepared by a kitchen staff she had not yet met, in a silence so complete she could hear her own fork against the china. She thought of her family's kitchen table, small and worn, always filled with noise and conversation even during their hardest months. This grand, empty room felt like the loneliest place she had ever been. She caught sight of Alexander only once that first week, from a distance, as he crossed the courtyard toward a waiting car, deep in conversation with two men in dark suits. He did not look toward her window, though she was certain, for just a moment, that his stride slowed slightly as he passed beneath it. Days settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Alina woke early out of habit, dressed simply despite the closet full of new clothes that had appeared without explanation, and spent her mornings exploring the house or reading in the library, a room so vast it made her family's entire home look like a single closet. She wrote letters to her parents, careful never to mention how isolated she felt, focusing instead on describing the gardens, the strange grandeur of it all, anything that would ease their worry rather than add to it. By the second week, she had learned the names of most of the household staff, though many remained distant, unsure of how to treat a woman who was technically their mistress, but clearly did not belong in this world of marble floors and inherited titles. It was Grace, one of the younger housemaids, who first broke through the wall of formality. Alina found her one afternoon in the garden, struggling to carry a heavy basket of cut flowers toward the house, and without thinking, stepped in to help carry half the load. "Oh, you shouldn't be doing that, miss," Grace said quickly, though gratitude was clear on her tired face. "It isn't proper." "I don't mind," Alina said simply. "Besides, I'm not used to having people carry things for me. Feels strange to just stand around and watch." Grace studied her for a moment, surprise softening into something warmer. "You're not what I expected," she admitted quietly. "Most of the staff figured you'd be like the others His Grace has dealt with before. Cold. Demanding." "There have been others?" Alina asked, curiosity pulling the question out before she could stop it. Grace's cheeks reddened slightly, realizing she had said more than intended. "Not wives, miss. Just women who wanted to be. His Grace never let any of them close. Keeps everyone at arm's length, if you understand my meaning." Alina filed that piece of information away carefully as they continued walking toward the house together, the beginning of an unlikely friendship taking root between them, despite the strange circumstances that had brought Alina into this world in the first place. It was nearly 2 weeks into her stay before she encountered Alexander properly again, this time in the long gallery that connected the east and west wings of the house. He was standing before one of the portraits, hands clasped behind his back, so still that Alina almost did not notice him until she was nearly beside him. "Your Grace," she said, stopping abruptly. Alexander turned, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed across his face before his usual composure settled back into place. "Alina," he said, using her name for the first time since their meeting in his study. "Settling in, I trust." "Yes," she said simply, though the word felt inadequate for the strange, lonely weeks she had just lived through. He studied her for a moment, his gray eyes moving over her face as though searching for something specific. "The staff tells me you've been wandering the gardens and spending time in the library. Is that a problem?" "No," he said, something almost like surprise in his voice. "Most people in your position would have demanded a shopping trip to the city by now, or complained about the isolation." Alina tilted her head slightly, studying him in return. "I'm not most people," she said simply, "and I didn't sign that contract for shopping trips." Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of genuine interest breaking through the careful mask he wore, though he covered it quickly, clearing his throat and glancing back toward the portrait beside them. "This was my grandfather," he said, nodding toward the painting, though Alina sensed he was changing the subject deliberately. "The one whose will brought us here." Alina studied the portrait, an older man with the same sharp jaw as Alexander, though his eyes held a warmth that seemed absent from his grandson's carefully guarded expression. "He looks like he cared about you," she said quietly. "He did," Alexander said, and for just a moment his voice lost some of its careful control. More than most people ever have. The silence that followed felt different from the cold distance of their first meeting, something softer settling between them, though neither seemed sure what to do with it. "I should let you get back to your evening," Alina finally said, breaking the moment. Alexander nodded once, though as she turned to walk away, his voice stopped her. "Alina," he said. She turned back to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite name. "Thank you for not making this harder than it needs to be." It was the closest thing to genuine gratitude she had heard from him since arriving, and something about the quiet sincerity in his voice stayed with her long after she returned to her room that night, replaying the strange, unexpected moment in the gallery, until sleep finally claimed her. Neither of them spoke of it again in the days that followed, but something had shifted, subtle and quiet, a small crack in the wall that had stood so firmly between them since the moment she signed her name on that contract, and neither of them yet understood exactly what it meant. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Margaret delivered the news Alina had been quietly dreading since her arrival. "His Grace requires your attendance at the Winthrop Gala on Saturday," Margaret said, standing in the doorway of Alina's room with a garment bag draped carefully over one arm. "It is the first public event since the announcement of your marriage. All of society will be watching." Alina's stomach tightened. She had read about the Winthrop Gala in old magazines her mother kept, a glittering annual event attended by the wealthiest families in the country, the kind of gathering where old money mingled with older money, and everyone knew exactly who belonged and who did not. "I understand," Alina said, forcing steadiness into her voice. Margaret hung the garment bag in the closet, her expression softening slightly, an unusual crack in her typically formal manner. "May I offer a piece of advice, miss?" Alina nodded. "Whatever they say to you Saturday night, and they will say plenty, do not let them see it land," Margaret said. "These people have spent their entire lives learning how to wound with a smile. The moment they see it works, they will never stop." Alina thought about those words for the rest of the week, turning them over in her mind while she practiced walking in the heeled shoes that had appeared in her closet. While she studied the guest list Margaret provided so she would recognize the important names. While she tried to memorize which fork belonged to which course during a formal dinner Margaret insisted on rehearsing with her twice. Alexander remained largely absent during those preparations, buried in business meetings that kept him away from the manor for long stretches at a time. Alina told herself his absence did not bother her, though she found herself listening for the sound of his car in the courtyard more often than she wanted to admit. Saturday arrived faster than she expected. Grace helped her into a deep green gown that had been tailored specifically for the event, and Alina barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. Hair swept elegantly to one side, makeup transforming her tired eyes into something that looked almost regal. "You look like you belong there," Grace said softly, adjusting the final pin in Alina's hair. "I don't feel like I do," Alina admitted. "Doesn't matter what you feel," Grace said with a small smile. "Only matters what they see." When Alina finally descended the grand staircase, Alexander was waiting at the bottom, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that made him look even more imposing than usual. He watched her descent with an expression she could not quite decode, something between surprise and quiet appreciation that vanished the moment she reached the final step. "You'll do," he said simply, though something in his tone suggested the words meant more than they let on. "High praise," Alina replied dryly, and for just a moment, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before he offered his arm and led her toward the waiting car. The Winthrop estate glowed with light when they arrived, every window illuminated, music drifting out into the cool evening air. Alina felt Alexander's hand settle firmly at the small of her back as they walked through the entrance, a silent reminder that they were meant to appear as a unified pair, no matter how strange the reality behind that appearance actually was. "Remember," Alexander murmured close to her ear as they entered the crowded ballroom, "you belong here as much as anyone in this room." Alina nodded, though the sea of curious, calculating eyes that turned toward them the moment they stepped inside made his reassurance feel distant and thin. The first hour passed in a blur of introductions, names and titles blending together as Alexander guided her through the crowd with practiced ease. Most guests were polite, if distant, offering careful smiles and vague pleasantries before moving on to more interesting conversations. Alina began to relax, thinking perhaps the evening would pass without the difficulty Margaret had warned her about. Then she met Victoria Ashcombe. Victoria approached with the confident grace of someone who had never once doubted her place in a room, her pale blonde hair perfectly styled, her diamond earrings catching the light with every small movement of her head. She looked Alina over slowly, deliberately, the way someone might examine an item at a market they had no intention of purchasing. "So this is the famous Alina," Victoria said, her voice sweet and sharp all at once. "I must say, Alexander, you've certainly surprised everyone." "Victoria," Alexander said, his tone carefully neutral. "I've heard the most fascinating things," Victoria continued, ignoring the warning in his voice completely. "An accountant, is that right? From some little firm no one's ever heard of. It's rather charming, really, like something from an old film." "I run the firm with my father," Alina said evenly, refusing to let her voice waver. "It's honest work." "Oh, I'm sure it is," Victoria said with a laugh that carried no real warmth. "Though I have to wonder what you two possibly discuss over dinner. Spreadsheets, perhaps. Tax deductions." A few guests nearby laughed softly, and Alina felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she kept her expression carefully composed, remembering Margaret's advice. "Do not let them see it land." "Actually," Alina said, her voice steady and calm, "I find most conversations more interesting when they involve people who have something real to say, rather than people who need to insult a stranger to feel important at a party." The words landed with quiet precision, and for a moment, Victoria's confident smile faltered, surprise flickering across her polished features before she recovered with a tight laugh. "How very direct," Victoria said, glancing at Alexander as though expecting him to intervene on her behalf. Instead, Alexander's expression had shifted into something Alina had never seen there before, a flash of genuine amusement, quickly hidden but unmistakable all the same. "My wife has always been direct," he said smoothly, the word wife slipping easily from his lips for the first time that evening. "It's one of the things I find most refreshing." Victoria's smile tightened further before she excused herself with a stiff nod, disappearing into the crowd without another word. The moment she was gone, Alexander leaned slightly closer to Alina, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "That was well handled," he said, something like admiration coloring his tone. "I've dealt with worse than her," Alina said simply. "Difficult clients teach you how to hold your ground." "Apparently so," Alexander said, and for the rest of the evening, something in his manner toward her had shifted, subtle but undeniable, a warmth replacing the careful distance he usually maintained. They danced once, near the end of the evening, a slow, formal dance that required little conversation but placed them closer together than they had ever been. Alina felt the warmth of his hand at her waist, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and found herself acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched during the careful, practiced movements of the dance. "You handled tonight better than most people twice your experience in this world," Alexander said quietly as they moved together across the polished floor. "I had good motivation," Alina replied. "I wasn't about to let someone like Victoria make me regret helping my family." Alexander studied her face for a long moment, something thoughtful in his gray eyes. "Most people in your position would have taken the money and hidden in a corner all evening, hoping no one would notice them," he said. "You walked in and made them notice you on your own terms instead." "Is that a compliment, Your Grace?" Alina asked, a small smile finally breaking through her careful composure. "It might be," Alexander admitted, and the small smile that answered hers felt more honest than anything he had offered her since the day she signed his contract. The drive home was quiet, though the silence felt different from the cold distance of their earlier weeks together, something more comfortable settling between them as the city lights gave way to dark countryside roads. Elena watched Alexander's profile in the dim light of the car, noticing for the first time the small signs of exhaustion beneath his composed exterior, the weight he carried that went beyond simple business obligations. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "You can ask," Alexander said, though his tone made no promises about answering. "Why does everyone treat you like you're made of stone?" Elena asked. "Even tonight, people seemed almost afraid of you, more than they respect you." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the passing darkness outside the window. "Because stone doesn't get hurt," he finally said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "And in my world, showing anything else is a weakness people will use against you the moment they find it." Elena thought about Grace's words from weeks earlier, about the women who had wanted to be close to him and been kept firmly at arm's length instead. She wondered how long he had been building that wall around himself, and how much it must have cost him to maintain it. "That sounds lonely," she said softly. Alexander turned to look at her then, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face before he caught himself and looked away again. "It is," he admitted quietly, the honesty of the confession surprising them both in the quiet darkness of the car. Neither of them spoke again for the rest of the drive, but when they arrived back at the manor, Alexander walked her to her door instead of disappearing immediately toward his own wing, as he had every other night since her arrival. "Thank you for tonight," he said, standing in the soft light of the hallway. "I mean that. You didn't have to defend yourself the way you did. Most people would have simply endured it." "I'm not most people," Elena reminded him, echoing her earlier words with a small smile. "No," Alexander said quietly, studying her face with an expression that made her heart beat a little faster. "You're really not." For a moment, something charged and uncertain hung in the air between them, neither quite moving, neither quite looking away. Then Alexander cleared his throat, stepped back, and offered a small, formal nod. "Good night, Elena," he said, and turned to walk toward his own wing of the house. Elena stood in her doorway long after he disappeared around the corner, her heart still racing from the strange, unexpected evening, from the wall that had begun to crack between them in ways neither of them had planned for when this arrangement began. She had signed that contract to save her family, expecting nothing more than a business transaction and a year of careful distance. She had not expected to start wondering what it would feel like if that distance disappeared entirely. After the gala, something in the rhythm of the house began to change, quietly, gradually, in ways that Elena almost did not notice until she found herself waiting for them. Alexander began appearing at dinner more often, sometimes only for a few minutes, sometimes for the entire meal, though conversation between them remained careful at first, guarded by habits neither of them had fully let go of yet. He asked about her day. She asked about his meetings. Small, safe questions that slowly began to grow into something deeper. One evening, nearly a month after the gala, Elena found him in the library long after the rest of the house had gone quiet for the night. She had come down for a book, expecting the room to be empty, and instead found Alexander seated near the fireplace, a glass of untouched amber liquid on the table beside him, a folder of documents forgotten in his lap while he stared into the flames. "I didn't expect anyone else to be awake," Elena said, hesitating in the doorway. "Neither did I," Alexander admitted, though he did not ask her to leave. Elena stepped further into the room, drawn by something in his expression she had not seen before, a heaviness that seemed to weigh on him more than usual. "Bad news?" she asked, nodding toward the folder in his lap. "Just old memories," he said quietly. "My grandfather used to sit in this exact chair, reading mostly, sometimes just thinking. I used to sit on the floor beside him when I was young, and he would tell me stories about the family, about what it meant to carry the Wren name." "You miss him," Elena said, taking the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Every day," Alexander admitted, the honesty of the confession surprising them both. He was the only person who ever saw me as more than the title I was born into. Everyone else, even my own parents, cared more about what I represented than who I actually was. Alina studied him carefully, seeing past the careful composure to the quiet loneliness beneath it, the same loneliness she had glimpsed briefly in the car after the gala. "Is that why you built all these walls?" she asked gently. "Because it was safer than being seen as just a person, only to be disappointed again." Alexander looked at her then, something startled in his gray eyes, as though no one had ever put the truth so plainly in front of him before. "Perhaps," he admitted quietly. "It's easier to be respected than to be truly known. Respect doesn't leave when it's inconvenient, it doesn't disappoint you." "But it's not the same as being cared for," Alina said softly. "No," Alexander agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It isn't." They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, the fire crackling softly between them, and Alina found herself studying the man across from her with new eyes, seeing past the cold, commanding Duke who had greeted her in that first meeting to the guarded, lonely man hiding carefully beneath the surface. "Tell me about your family," Alexander said eventually, breaking the silence. "The real story, not the summary in whatever file my people compiled about your finances." Alina smiled slightly at that, appreciating the honesty of the request. "My father started the accounting firm when I was young," she began. "It was small but steady for years, enough to keep us comfortable even if we were never wealthy. Then about 2 years ago, one of our biggest clients turned out to be running a fraud scheme. We had no idea, of course, but when it collapsed, so did our reputation. Other clients left. The debts started piling up faster than we could manage them." "That must have been difficult," Alexander said quietly. "It was terrifying," Alina admitted. "Watching everything my father built for over 20 years slowly fall apart, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it no matter how many extra hours I worked, how many nights I stayed up trying to find solutions in the numbers. That's why I signed your contract without hesitation. I had already spent 2 years fighting a losing battle. Your offer wasn't a difficult decision. It was the first real solution I'd been offered in a very long time." Alexander was quiet for a moment, processing her words with an expression Alina could not quite read. "You never once asked for more than what I offered," he said eventually. "Most people in your position would have tried to negotiate a better deal, especially once they realized how much I needed this marriage to happen." "I'm not interested in taking more than I need," Alina said simply. "The contract solved my family's problem. That was enough." "That's rare," Alexander said quietly, something like wonder in his voice. "In my world, everyone always wants more. More money, more access, more of my name attached to their own ambitions. You're the first person in longer than I can remember who seemed satisfied with exactly what was offered and nothing else." "Maybe your world just needs better people in it," Alina said with a small, teasing smile, and for the first time since she had known him, Alexander laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised, as though the sound itself was unfamiliar to him. "Maybe it does," he agreed, still smiling as the laughter faded, and something in his gray eyes had softened considerably, warmth replacing the careful distance that had defined every previous interaction between them. They talked for hours that night, longer than Alina had intended, covering everything from her childhood memories of helping her father balance client accounts at the kitchen table to Alexander's own struggles growing up under the weight of expectations he had never asked for. By the time she finally excused herself to go to bed, the fire had burned down to embers, and the sky outside the library windows had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. "Good night, Alina," Alexander said as she paused in the doorway, his voice carrying a warmth she had never heard from him before that evening. "Good night, Alexander," she replied, using his given name for the first time since arriving at the manor, and the small, surprised smile that crossed his face stayed with her long after she climbed the stairs toward her own room. From that night forward, their evenings in the library became a quiet, unspoken habit, a shared space where the careful distance of their contract began to feel less like a wall and more like a formality neither of them fully believed in anymore. Alexander began sharing pieces of himself. Alina suspected he had never shared with anyone else. Memories of his grandfather, fears about running the company his family had built over generations, doubts he carried about whether he was truly worthy of the responsibility placed on his shoulders. In turn, Alina found herself opening up in ways she had not expected, sharing dreams she had buried under years of financial worry, hopes for a future she had not allowed herself to imagine while she was busy trying to save her family from collapse. The household staff noticed the change long before either of them acknowledged it openly. Margaret's formal reports to Alina grew warmer, less guarded. Grace began teasing Alina gently about the late nights in the library, though she was careful never to push too far into territory Alina clearly was not ready to discuss. Even the way Alexander looked at Alina across the breakfast table each morning had shifted, something softer replacing the careful, calculating gaze from their first meeting, though neither of them spoke openly about what that shift might mean for an arrangement that had begun as nothing more than a business transaction. One afternoon, nearly 2 months into her stay, Alina found herself standing in the garden with Grace, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall from the trees lining the property. "You've changed him," Grace said quietly, watching Alina's expression carefully. "The staff has all noticed, he smiles more. He's here more, at the manor, instead of burying himself in the city offices to avoid coming home." "I haven't done anything," Alina said, though the words felt uncertain even as she spoke them. "Maybe not on purpose," Grace said with a small, knowing smile. "But you have, miss, whether you meant to or not." Alina thought about those words long after Grace had returned to her duties, watching the wind carry another handful of golden leaves across the quiet garden. She thought about the careful, guarded man she had met in that study 2 months earlier, and the warmer, more open person who had begun emerging in the quiet hours they now shared together in the library each evening. She had signed that contract expecting a year of careful distance, a business arrangement with clear boundaries, and no room for anything beyond what was written on paper. She had not expected to find herself slowly, quietly falling for the very man that contract had bound her to, nor had she expected to catch him, more than once now, looking at her with an expression that suggested he might be falling just as quietly in return. Neither of them spoke of it yet, the fear of disrupting something fragile and new keeping both of them carefully silent. But the walls that had once stood so firmly between them had begun to crumble, piece by piece, evening by evening, and neither Alina nor Alexander seemed particularly interested in stopping the slow, quiet collapse. The call came on a Tuesday morning, while Alina was in the garden with Grace, cutting fresh flowers for the dining room table. Margaret appeared at the garden door, her expression tighter than usual, holding a phone out toward Alina. "It's your mother, miss," Margaret said. "She says it's urgent." Alina's stomach dropped immediately. Her mother never called during working hours, always mindful of not intruding on whatever new life Alina was building at the manor. She crossed the garden quickly, taking the phone with hands that had already begun to shake. "Mom, what's wrong?" Her mother's voice on the other end was tight with barely controlled panic. "It's Daniel," she said. "He collapsed at school this morning. They rushed him to the hospital. Alina, they're saying it's serious. The doctors want to run more tests, but the treatment they're recommending, it's expensive, so expensive. And we just used everything we had to pay off the last of the business debt like we promised the Duke we would." "Mom, breathe," Alina said, though her own heart was pounding painfully in her chest. "Which hospital? I'm coming right now." She ended the call and stood frozen in the garden for a moment, her mind racing. Daniel was her younger brother, only 16 years old, the baby of the family that everyone had worked so hard to protect through their financial troubles. He had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition 3 years earlier, something Alina had never mentioned to Alexander, never mentioned to anyone outside her immediate family. The condition had been manageable with medication and careful monitoring, expensive but manageable, one of the many financial burdens buried beneath the larger crisis of their family's failing business. She had not told Alexander because the contract was about her father's business, not her family's medical history, and some part of her had wanted to keep at least one piece of her family's struggle private, separate from the transaction that had brought her into his life. Now, standing in the garden with her hands still shaking from her mother's call, that careful privacy suddenly felt like a terrible mistake. "Grace, I need to get to the hospital," Alina said, already moving toward the house. "My brother, he's sick, he's really sick, and I don't know if I have enough time to arrange transportation." "I'll get the car brought around immediately," Grace said, already moving toward the house herself, her earlier hesitation about proper procedure forgotten in the face of Alina's obvious distress. Alina barely remembered the drive to the hospital, her mind consumed with worry, with guilt over the secret she had kept, with fear over what she might find when she arrived. By the time she reached Daniel's room, her mother was pacing the small waiting area outside, her father sitting with his head in his hands, the weight of yet another crisis clearly wearing on him after months of financial stress. "How is he?" Alina asked, pulling her mother into a tight hug. "Stable for now," her mother said, her voice trembling. "But the doctor says his condition has worsened. He needs a procedure, a serious one, and the cost, Alina, it's more than we could ever hope to pay, even with the business debts cleared." Alina spent the next several hours at the hospital, sitting beside her brother's bed, listening to doctors explain treatment options with price tags that made her stomach turn, watching her parents' exhausted faces as they tried to process yet another crisis threatening to overwhelm their family. By the time she finally left that evening, promising to return the next morning, she felt hollowed out, uncertain how she would find a way to help without breaking the careful boundaries of the arrangement she had made with Alexander. She did not go back to the manor that night, choosing instead to stay at her parents' small house, sleeping fitfully on the couch while her mind circled endlessly around the impossible problem in front of her. Alexander noticed her absence immediately. When she finally returned to Wren Manor 2 days later, exhausted and pale from lack of sleep, she found him waiting in the entrance hall, his expression a careful mixture of concern and barely restrained frustration. "Alina," he said, crossing the hall toward her quickly, "where have you been? Margaret said there was some kind of family emergency, but no one could tell me anything more than that." "It's fine," Alina said, though her voice cracked slightly on the words, betraying the exhaustion and worry she had been carrying for 2 sleepless days. "It's a family matter. I'll handle it." "You clearly haven't slept in days," Alexander said, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Alina, whatever this is, you don't have to handle it alone. Talk to me." For a long moment, Alina considered maintaining her silence, protecting the last private corner of her family's struggle from the contract that governed the rest of her life. But exhaustion and worry had worn down her defenses, and something in Alexander's genuine concern made the careful walls she had built feel suddenly unnecessary. "My brother is sick," she finally said, her voice breaking as the words spilled out. "Daniel, he's 16. He has a heart condition, has for 3 years now, and we've managed it, but this week it got worse, so much worse, and the doctors say he needs a procedure that costs more money than my family has ever seen in their entire lives. And I don't know what to do, Alexander. I genuinely don't know what to do." Alexander's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like hurt. "Why didn't you tell me this immediately?" he asked quietly. "Why did you carry this alone for 2 days?" "Because it wasn't part of our arrangement," Alina said, tears finally spilling over despite her efforts to hold them back. "The contract was about my father's business. I couldn't ask you for more than what we agreed to. It wouldn't be fair." "Fair," Alexander repeated, something fierce entering his voice. "Alina, you signed away a year of your life without hesitation to save your family. Do you honestly believe I would refuse to help when your brother's life is at risk, simply because it wasn't written into some contract?" Alina looked up at him, uncertain how to respond, the exhaustion and fear of the past 2 days finally overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Alexander stepped closer, and before she fully understood what was happening, he had pulled her into his arms, holding her steady while the tears she had been suppressing finally broke free. "I'm sorry," she said into his shoulder, her voice muffled and thick with emotion. "I didn't want to add another burden to everything you've already done for my family." "You are not a burden," Alexander said firmly, his hand moving gently against her back in a way that felt more genuine than anything she had experienced in her entire time at the manor. "Alina, listen to me. Whatever your brother needs, he will have it. Immediately. No conditions, no additions to any contract. This isn't a negotiation." Alina pulled back slightly, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any hint that his offer came with hidden strings she had not yet discovered. But his gray eyes held nothing but sincerity, a fierce, protective determination that stole the breath from her lungs. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she whispered. "You don't need to thank me," Alexander said quietly. "Just let me help, please." Within hours, Alexander had arranged for Daniel to be transferred to one of the finest cardiac specialists in the country, covering every cost of treatment without a single condition attached beyond his genuine concern for the boy's well-being. He accompanied Alina to the hospital the following morning, standing quietly beside her while doctors explained the treatment plan in detail, asking careful, informed questions that revealed a depth of concern Alina had not expected from a man who had entered her life through nothing more than a business contract. Her parents, initially wary of the powerful stranger who had suddenly become part of their family's story, quickly warmed to Alexander's genuine warmth toward Daniel, his patience in explaining complicated medical terms in simpler language for their sake, his quiet insistence on covering every expense without ever making them feel indebted or ashamed for needing the help. "He's not what I expected," her father admitted quietly to Alina one evening, watching Alexander sit beside Daniel's hospital bed, engaged in an animated conversation about a video game Daniel had been playing before his collapse. "When you first told us about the contract, I imagined someone cold, distant, someone who saw you as nothing more than a convenient solution to his own problem." "I imagined the same thing at first," Alina admitted, watching Alexander laugh at something Daniel had said, his careful composure completely absent in this quiet moment with her family. "He surprised me, more than once now." Daniel's procedure took place a week later, a delicate surgery that left the entire family holding their breath in the waiting room for nearly 6 hours. Alexander stayed the entire time, canceling important business meetings without hesitation, sitting beside Alina as the hours stretched on, holding her hand tightly whenever the waiting became too much to bear in silence. When the surgeon finally emerged to explain that the procedure had been successful, that Daniel would need time to recover but should expect a full return to health, Alina felt the weight of weeks of fear finally lift from her shoulders. She turned toward Alexander instinctively, and he pulled her into his arms without hesitation, holding her tightly while relief washed over both of them. "Thank you," Alina whispered against his chest. "Thank you for not letting me carry this alone." "I meant what I said," Alexander replied quietly, his voice rough with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "You are not a burden, Alina, not to me, not ever." In the weeks that followed, as Daniel slowly recovered under the careful watch of the specialists Alexander had arranged, something fundamental had shifted between Alina and Alexander, deeper and more significant than anything that had grown between them in their quiet evenings in the library. The crisis had stripped away the last remnants of careful distance that had defined their arrangement, revealing something far more genuine underneath. Alina found herself watching Alexander with new eyes, seeing not just the guarded duke who had commanded her to sign and leave in that first meeting, nor even the warmer, more open man who had begun emerging in their late-night conversations, but someone who had proven, through action rather than mere words, exactly how deeply he cared for her well-being and the well-being of everyone she loved. And Alexander, for his part, found himself unable to ignore the truth that had been building steadily since the night of the Winthrop Gala, a truth that had crystallized completely during those long hours in the hospital waiting room, watching Alina's fear and love for her brother, holding her hand through the worst hours of uncertainty. He had entered this arrangement seeking nothing more than a solution to a legal problem, a clean, uncomplicated transaction that would satisfy his grandfather's will, without any of the messy entanglements he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. Instead, he had found himself falling deeply, irrevocably in love with the quiet, determined woman who had walked into his study 3 months earlier and signed away a year of her life without a single moment of hesitation, and he was no longer certain he wanted that year to ever come to an end. Daniel's recovery brought a new lightness to Wren Manor that Alina had not felt since the earliest days of her family's troubles began. She visited him twice a week, watching him regain his strength and color, grateful beyond words for the second chance Alexander had made possible. But even as one crisis resolved, another had already begun quietly forming in the background, one that would test the fragile trust growing between Alina and Alexander in ways neither of them anticipated. It started with a phone call Alina overheard by accident one evening, passing by Alexander's study on her way to the library. His voice carried through the partially open door, tight with barely controlled anger in a way she had never heard from him before. "I don't care what Harrington thinks he can prove," Alexander said sharply. "My grandfather built this company from nothing. I will not let some opportunist tear it apart, because he thinks a scandal will drive down our stock price enough for him to buy in cheap." Alina paused outside the door, uncertain whether to interrupt or continue toward the library as she had planned. Before she could decide, Alexander ended the call and looked up, spotting her through the gap in the doorway. "Alina," he said, his voice softening immediately despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. "Come in. I suppose you heard some of that." "Is everything all right?" Alina asked, stepping into the study, the same room where she had signed that fateful contract nearly 3 months earlier, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. Alexander rubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion evident beneath his usual composed exterior. "Not entirely," he admitted. "There's a man named Charles Harrington, a business rival who has spent years trying to find a way into our company. He's recently discovered some old financial irregularities from before my time running things, minor issues my grandfather resolved decades ago. But Harrington is threatening to twist the story into something far more damaging if I don't sell him a significant stake in the company at a price well below its actual value." "That sounds like extortion," Alina said, her accounting background immediately sharpening her attention to the details. "It is essentially," Alexander said, "but proving that in a way that protects the company's reputation rather than damaging it further is complicated. Harrington is clever. He's built his entire approach around plausible deniability, threats disguised as friendly business advice." Alina hesitated for a moment before speaking again, an idea forming in her mind based on years spent poring over financial records for her father's clients. "Would you let me look at the documents?" she asked. "The old financial records Harrington is referencing. I might be able to see something your legal team is missing, simply because I approach numbers differently than lawyers do." Alexander studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the unusual offer. Alina Marsh, the quiet accountant he had married for nothing more than a legal technicality, was now offering to help untangle a threat to one of the largest companies in the country. "You don't have to involve yourself in this," he said carefully. "This isn't part of our arrangement." "Neither was helping my brother," Alina reminded him gently, "and you did that without a second thought. Let me help, Alexander, please." Something in his expression shifted, gratitude mixing with something warmer, something that had been growing steadily between them since the night of Daniel's surgery. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll have the documents brought to the library tomorrow morning." For the next several days, Alina buried herself in the old financial records, staying up late into the night alongside Alexander, poring over decades of transactions with the same careful precision she had once applied to her father's struggling accounts. The work reminded her of the skills she had honed over years of necessity, the ability to spot inconsistencies others might overlook, patterns hidden beneath layers of complicated paperwork. On the fourth night, exhausted but determined, Alina finally found what she had been searching for, a discrepancy buried in a series of transactions from nearly 15 years earlier, evidence that directly contradicted the story Harrington had been quietly spreading among select board members and investors. "Alexander," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet library where he sat across from her, reviewing his own set of documents. "I think I found something." He crossed the room quickly, leaning over her shoulder to study the papers spread across the table. Alina walked him through her findings carefully, explaining the pattern she had noticed, the way the numbers actually told a story completely different from the version Harrington had been threatening to reveal. "This proves Harrington knows the accusations are false," Alina said, pointing to a specific transaction record. "He was actually involved in these dealings himself on the other side of the table. If this comes out, it doesn't just protect your company's reputation. It exposes exactly what he's really trying to do." Alexander stared at the documents for a long moment, then looked up at Alina with an expression of pure astonishment mixed with something that looked remarkably like pride. "My entire legal team spent 2 weeks looking through these same records," he said quietly, "and they found nothing close to this." "They were looking for legal loopholes," Alina said with a small smile. "I was just looking for numbers that didn't add up. Different training, I suppose." Alexander laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that filled the quiet library. "You just saved my company, Alina," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Do you understand that? You just single-handedly dismantled a threat that has been keeping me awake at night for weeks." "I had good teachers," Alina said softly, thinking of her father's patient lessons over their kitchen table years ago. "And good motivation." Alexander's expression grew serious then, something deeper passing between them in the quiet space of the library. "Alina," he said carefully, "I need you to know something. What I feel for you, it stopped being about the contract a long time ago. I don't know exactly when it happened, whether it was the gala, or the hospital, or just these quiet evenings we've spent together. But I am no longer able to think of you as simply a business arrangement." Alina's heart pounded painfully in her chest, the words she had been afraid to hope for finally spoken aloud. "Alexander," she began, uncertain how to respond to something she had felt building inside herself for weeks now. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, though his gray eyes searched her face with obvious hope. "I just needed you to know. Whatever happens when this year ends, whatever you decide, I wanted you to know the truth." Alina reached out slowly, placing her hand over his where it rested on the table between the scattered financial documents that had brought them to this moment. "I feel the same way," she said quietly, watching relief and joy flood across his face. "I have for a while now. I was just afraid to say it, afraid it would complicate something that was supposed to be simple." "Nothing about this has ever been simple," Alexander said with a small, wondering laugh, turning his hand beneath hers so their fingers could intertwine properly. "Not since the moment you signed that contract without hesitation and left me completely speechless." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken feelings finally acknowledged between them, before Alina remembered the pressing matter still requiring their attention. "We should get this evidence to your legal team immediately," she said, though she made no move to remove her hand from his. "Harrington needs to know his plan has failed before he tries anything else." Alexander nodded, though he lifted her hand to his lips first, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "Tomorrow," he agreed softly. "Tonight, just for a little while longer, let's simply enjoy this moment." The following morning, Alexander's legal team moved quickly on the evidence Alina had uncovered, presenting it directly to the board of directors alongside a carefully worded statement that made clear exactly what Harrington had attempted to do. Within days, Harrington's threats collapsed entirely, his own involvement in the original transactions exposed to the very board members he had hoped to manipulate, his reputation among serious investors damaged beyond easy repair. Alexander held a small celebration at the manor once the threat had fully passed. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet dinner with a few trusted members of his senior staff who had worked alongside him through the crisis. Alina sat beside him throughout the evening, no longer positioned as a distant, contractual wife, but as a genuine partner who had proven her worth through action rather than mere obligation. To Alina, Alexander said, raising his glass toward the small gathered group, his eyes never leaving her face. Without whose sharp eye and stubborn determination, this company might have faced a very different outcome. The staff raised their glasses in agreement, genuine warmth and respect visible in their expressions now, a stark contrast to the suspicious whispers that had greeted Alina's arrival at the manor months earlier. Margaret, standing near the doorway overseeing the evening service, caught Alina's eye and offered a small, approving nod that meant more to Alina than she expected. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the manor had settled into quiet stillness, Alexander walked Alina to her door as he had begun doing regularly in recent weeks. But this time, instead of the formal good night that had become their routine, he paused, studying her face in the soft hallway light. "Alina," he said quietly, "may I kiss you?" The question, so careful and respectful despite everything that had grown between them, made Alina's heart swell with an emotion she could no longer deny. "Yes," she whispered. Alexander leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, before his lips finally met hers in a kiss that felt like the culmination of every quiet moment they had shared since that first strange meeting in his study. It was gentle at first, careful, before deepening into something that spoke of months of carefully suppressed feelings finally allowed to surface. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Alexander rested his forehead gently against hers, a small, genuine smile lighting his features in a way Alina had never seen before that moment. "I think," he said softly, "that contract of ours might need some revisions." Alina laughed, the sound filled with a happiness she had not expected to find when she first signed her name on that fateful document months earlier. "I think I might agree with that, Your Grace," she whispered back, and the warmth of his answering smile stayed with her long after he finally bid her good night and disappeared toward his own wing of the grand, quiet house that had somehow, slowly, become something she was beginning to think of as home. The peace that had settled over Wren Manor in the weeks following the confrontation with Harrington did not last as long as either Alina or Alexander had hoped. It began with an unannounced arrival on a gray Thursday afternoon, a sleek car pulling into the courtyard while Alina sat with Alexander in the study, reviewing quarterly reports together in the comfortable, easy partnership that had become their new normal. Margaret appeared at the door, her expression tight with obvious tension. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "your uncle has arrived. He says it's urgent." Alexander's entire posture shifted at the mention of his uncle. The warmth that had become so familiar over recent weeks replaced instantly by a guarded wariness Alina had not seen since their earliest days together. "Send him in," Alexander said, his voice clipped and formal in a way that immediately put Alina on alert. The man who entered moments later shared Alexander's sharp jaw and tall build, though his eyes held none of the warmth that had slowly emerged in Alexander over the past months. He looked Alina over with obvious disdain before turning his full attention to his nephew. "Alexander," the man said, his voice smooth and cold. "I see you're still playing house with your little arrangement." "Uncle Edward," Alexander said stiffly, "this is unexpected. What brings you to the manor?" Edward settled into a chair without waiting for an invitation, crossing one leg over the other with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "I've been doing some research," he said, his gaze flicking briefly toward Alina before returning to his nephew. "Into your marriage. Rather convenient timing, wasn't it? Signed just weeks before your birthday deadline, to a woman with no family connections, no social standing, someone who conveniently needed money at the exact moment you needed a wife." Alina felt her stomach tighten with dread, understanding immediately where this conversation was heading. "Get to the point, Edward," Alexander said, his jaw tightening visibly. The point, Edward said, leaning forward slightly, is that I intend to challenge the validity of this marriage before the estate's legal trustees. A marriage of pure convenience, arranged specifically to satisfy an inheritance clause, is not what my father intended when he wrote that will. I believe a court will agree that this arrangement constitutes fraud against the estate's true purpose, which would leave the inheritance and control of the company to me as the next eligible heir. That's absurd, Alexander snapped, standing abruptly from his chair. This marriage is entirely legitimate. Is it? Edward asked, a cold smile spreading across his face. Then you won't mind if my legal team investigates thoroughly. Interviews with staff, financial records showing exactly what your new wife's family received, and when, a careful examination of whether genuine affection exists between you or simply a business transaction dressed up in wedding vows. Alina watched the color drain slightly from Alexander's face, understanding the very real threat Edward's words represented. Their marriage had, in fact, begun exactly as Edward described, a calculated business arrangement between two people who had never intended anything beyond a contractual relationship. The genuine feelings that had grown between them since then would mean nothing if Edward's legal team focused specifically on the circumstances surrounding their original agreement. You won't win this, Edward, Alexander said, though Alina could hear the underlying uncertainty in his voice. We'll see, Edward said, rising smoothly from his chair. I'll be in touch with the trustees within the week. I suggest you prepare yourself and your little wife for some rather uncomfortable questions. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving a thick silence in his wake. Alexander stood by the window, watching Edward's car disappear down the long drive, his shoulders tense with barely controlled frustration. He's serious about this, Alexander finally said, turning to face Alina. Edward has wanted control of the company for years. He'll use every resource available to prove our marriage was nothing more than a convenient arrangement. Because it was originally, Alina said quietly, voicing the uncomfortable truth neither of them had spoken aloud in weeks, at least at the beginning. But it isn't any more, Alexander said firmly, crossing the room to stand before her. Alina, what we have now, it's real, you know that. I know that, Alina said, but will a room full of legal trustees believe it, especially with your uncle presenting every detail of how our arrangement actually began? The contract, the payments to my family, the timing of everything just weeks before your deadline. On paper, it looks exactly like what he's claiming it to be. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his tense posture. I won't lose this company because Edward decides to weaponize the way our relationship started, he said. And I certainly won't lose you because of his ambitions. Then we fight, Alina said, her voice steadying with sudden determination. We show the trustees everything that's happened since that first meeting. The gala, the hospital, the nights in the library, the way you've built a real partnership with me instead of just a contractual arrangement. We show them the truth, all of it, and let them see for themselves what our marriage has actually become. Over the following days, Alina and Alexander worked tirelessly to prepare for the hearing Edward had promised, gathering evidence of the genuine relationship that had developed between them, statements from staff members who had witnessed the transformation in their household, records of the countless hours they had spent working together, supporting each other through crises that went far beyond the terms of any contract. Margaret provided a detailed account of the changes she had witnessed since Alina's arrival, describing Alexander's increased presence at the manor, his laughter, his willingness to engage with the household in ways he never had before Alina entered his life. Grace spoke of the countless evenings the couple had spent together in the library, the genuine warmth that had grown between them over shared meals and quiet conversations. Alina's own family provided perhaps the most compelling testimony, describing Alexander's unwavering support during Daniel's medical crisis, his presence at the hospital for 6 long hours during the surgery, his genuine care for a family he had no legal obligation to concern himself with beyond the terms of their original contract. The hearing took place 2 weeks later, in a formal conference room filled with somber-faced trustees and lawyers on both sides of the dispute. Edward sat confidently at one end of the long table, flanked by an aggressive legal team clearly prepared to dismantle any claim of genuine affection between Alexander and Alina. "The facts are simple," Edward's lawyer began, addressing the panel of trustees with practiced confidence. "This marriage was arranged within days of a legal deadline that would have cost the Duke his inheritance. The bride in question came from significant financial distress that was immediately resolved upon her signature on a prenuptial agreement drafted specifically for this arrangement. Every element points to a calculated transaction, not a genuine union." Alina felt her heart pounding as the lawyer continued, laying out the timeline of their relationship with cold, clinical precision that made everything sound exactly as calculated as Edward had claimed. When it finally came time for Alina and Alexander to present their case, she rose from her seat with careful determination, refusing to let fear overshadow the truth she intended to share. "Yes, our marriage began as an arrangement," Alina said, addressing the panel directly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I won't pretend otherwise. My family was in crisis, and Alexander offered a solution that saved us from financial ruin. That is the truth, and I have never been ashamed of it." She paused, taking a steadying breath before continuing. "But what began as an arrangement did not remain one. I have watched this man sit beside my brother's hospital bed for 6 hours during a surgery that had nothing to do with any contract between us. I have watched him defend me at social gatherings where I had no standing of my own, simply because he believed I deserved respect. I have worked alongside him to protect his company from exactly the kind of manipulation his own uncle is attempting right now, not because any contract required it, but because I care about what happens to him, deeply and genuinely." Alina turned to look at Alexander then, finding his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression of pure, unguarded love that stole her breath, even in the formal, tense atmosphere of the hearing room. "I did not fall in love with a title or an inheritance or anything written on that original contract," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I fell in love with a man who chose kindness even when it cost him nothing to remain distant, who chose honesty even when silence would have been easier, who showed me, through action rather than obligation, exactly what genuine partnership looks like. If that isn't a real marriage, then I don't know what the word means at all." The room fell silent following her words, several of the trustees exchanging glances, clearly moved by the raw sincerity of her testimony. Alexander rose then, moving to stand beside Alina, taking her hand firmly in his own. "My uncle is correct that this marriage began as a solution to a legal problem," Alexander said, addressing the panel with quiet, unwavering confidence. "But he is deeply wrong about what it has become. I have spent my entire life building walls around myself, trusting almost no one, expecting betrayal from anyone who claimed to care about me beyond what I could offer them. Alina tore down those walls without ever asking me to. She never wanted more than what our original agreement provided, and yet she has given me more than anyone else in my entire life, including, I regret to say, most members of my own family." He turned to look at his uncle then, his expression hardening slightly. "Edward is not challenging this marriage because he believes it violates the spirit of my grandfather's will. He is challenging it because he wants control of a company he has never earned the right to lead. I ask this panel to see this hearing for exactly what it truly is, an attempt by a bitter man to steal something he cannot achieve through his own merit." After a lengthy deliberation, the panel of trustees returned with their decision, unanimously ruling in favor of Alexander and Alina, dismissing Edward's challenge entirely and affirming the full legitimacy of their marriage under the terms of the original will. Edward left the hearing room without a word, his cold expression the only indication of his fury at losing a battle he had been so confident of winning. Outside the conference room, Alina finally allowed herself to breathe freely, the tension of the past 2 weeks slowly beginning to release from her shoulders. Alexander pulled her into a tight embrace, relief and joy evident in every line of his body. "You saved everything again," he murmured into her hair. "Just like you did with Harrington. I don't know what I would have done without you standing beside me through all of this." "We saved it together," Alina corrected gently, pulling back to look up at him. "That's what partnership means, Alexander. We face these things together now, not because a contract requires it, but because that's simply who we've become to each other." Alexander smiled down at her, the warmth in his gray eyes leaving no doubt about the sincerity of everything they had both declared before that panel of trustees. "Then let's go home," he said softly, "and start figuring out exactly what our future looks like, now that the past no longer has any hold over it." Winter arrived at Wren Manor with a quiet softness, snow settling over the gardens where Alina and Grace had once carried baskets of autumn flowers together, transforming the grounds into something that looked almost like a scene from one of the old paintings lining the manor's hallways. Nearly 5 months had passed since Alina first walked through those iron gates, uncertain and afraid, carrying nothing but the weight of her family's desperation and a determination to save the people she loved. She barely recognized that frightened woman anymore. The morning after the hearing's resolution, Alina woke to find a note slipped beneath her bedroom door, written in Alexander's careful, precise handwriting. "Meet me in the study at 10. There is something we need to discuss." The formal wording made her stomach flutter with nervous anticipation as she dressed and made her way downstairs, memories of that very first meeting in the same room flooding back with unexpected intensity. When she arrived, Alexander stood by the window, the same position he had occupied months earlier when he first laid out the terms of their strange arrangement. But everything else about the moment felt entirely different. "You wanted to see me," Alina said, stepping into the room she had once entered as a frightened stranger and now approached as someone who genuinely belonged there. Alexander turned to face her, and Alina immediately noticed the folder resting on his desk, the same original contract that had bound them together 5 months earlier. Her heart clenched slightly at the sight of it, uncertain what this moment might mean. "I've been thinking about that day," Alexander said quietly, walking toward the desk. "The day you signed this contract without a single moment of hesitation, leaving me standing here completely speechless, wondering what kind of woman could agree to something so significant with such calm certainty." "I remember," Alina said softly, watching him carefully. "I told you to sign and leave," Alexander continued, picking up the folder and studying it for a long moment. "I expected resistance, negotiation, perhaps even tears. I had prepared myself for every reaction except the one you actually gave me, this quiet, steady acceptance that left me completely unable to predict what kind of person you truly were." He looked up at her then, his gray eyes holding an emotion Alina had come to know intimately over these past months, warmth and sincerity that had replaced the cold calculation of their first meeting entirely. "I know now exactly what kind of person you are," Alexander said. "You are the woman who defended herself against Victoria Ashcombe without flinching, who spent weeks uncovering evidence that saved my company from Harrington's manipulation, who stood before a panel of trustees and spoke more honestly about love than anyone else I have ever known. You are the woman who taught me that respect and being truly known are not the same thing, and that I had been settling for the former my entire life while denying myself the latter." Alina felt tears gathering in her eyes as he spoke, the weight of everything they had experienced together settling warmly around her heart. "Alexander," she began, uncertain what to say to such an outpouring of genuine emotion. "Let me finish," he said gently, though a small smile touched his lips. He walked around the desk, standing directly before her now, the original contract still held loosely in one hand. "This document brought us together, Alina, but it was never truly about us. It was about solving a legal problem, satisfying a will's requirements, nothing more than that. Everything real that has happened between us since then, that happened despite this contract, not because of it." He held the document out toward her, and with a sudden movement that startled her, he tore it cleanly in half. Alina gasped softly, watching the torn pages flutter to the floor between them. "Alexander, what?" I don't want a marriage bound by contract anymore, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression. I want a marriage built on choice, on love freely given rather than obligation carefully fulfilled. So I'm asking you now, Alina, without any contract, without any legal deadline forcing either of our hands, will you stay married to me? Not because you signed a paper months ago, but because you choose to today and every day after this one. For a long moment, Alina simply stared at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity of his question, by everything it represented about how far they had traveled together since that cold, formal first meeting in this very room. She thought of her family, safe and whole, of Daniel's laughter as he recovered fully from his surgery, of the countless quiet evenings in the library that had slowly transformed a business arrangement into something she now recognized as genuine love. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion, though this time the hesitation she felt came not from fear or uncertainty, but from the overwhelming weight of happiness threatening to steal her voice entirely. Alexander, yes, I choose you. I choose this. Not because of any contract, but because somewhere along the way, without either of us fully realizing it, I fell completely in love with you. Alexander's face broke into a genuine, unguarded smile, the kind Alina had only glimpsed rarely during their earliest months together, before he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the emotion he had been carefully containing throughout their formal declaration to each other. I love you, he murmured against her lips, the words feeling entirely new despite everything they had already shared. I have loved you for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. I love you too, Alina whispered back, her arms wrapping around his neck as the last remnants of the torn contract lay forgotten on the floor beside them. They spent that afternoon together in quiet celebration, walking through the snow-covered gardens hand in hand, discussing the future they wanted to build together now that the shadow of contracts and legal obligations no longer hung over their relationship. Alexander spoke of wanting to formalize their marriage properly, a real wedding this time, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about their happiness, rather than simply fulfilling a legal requirement before a witness or two. I want your family there, he said as they walked, snow crunching softly beneath their boots. Your parents, Daniel, everyone who matters to you, and I want to invite the household staff too. Margaret, Grace, everyone who has watched this relationship grow from something so uncertain into what it's become. They'll love that, Alina said, smiling at the thought of Grace's excitement when she heard the news. Grace has been teasing me about our late nights in the library for months now. She'll be thrilled to finally see it lead somewhere official. Alexander laughed, the sound carrying easily across the quiet, snow-covered garden. I suppose I owe the entire staff an apology then, for taking so long to admit what apparently everyone else could see clearly before I allowed myself to. Better late than never, Alina teased gently, squeezing his hand. The wedding took place in early spring, in the same garden where Alina and Grace had first bonded over a heavy basket of flowers, now blooming vibrantly with new life after the long winter's rest. Alina's parents stood proudly among the guests, her father's eyes bright with tears as he watched his daughter, who had once carried the weight of their family's entire financial future on her shoulders, now stand radiant and genuinely happy beside a man who clearly adored her. Daniel, fully recovered and healthier than he had been in years, served as an enthusiastic groomsman, grinning throughout the entire ceremony with the easy joy of a teenager who understood, perhaps better than anyone else present, exactly how close his family had come to losing everything before Alexander's unexpected intervention changed the course of their lives entirely. Margaret oversaw the wedding preparations with the same formal precision she brought to every task at the manor, though Alina caught her dabbing at her eyes more than once during the ceremony itself, the careful composure of the head housekeeper finally cracking under the weight of genuine emotion. Grace stood near the front, practically vibrating with excitement, having personally helped Alina into her wedding gown that morning with hands that shook slightly from pure happiness for her friend. As Alina walked down the garden aisle toward Alexander, past rows of guests who had watched their unlikely love story unfold over the past months. She thought back to that terrified drive to Wren Manor so many months earlier, uncertain of what awaited her behind those imposing iron gates. She could never have imagined in her wildest thoughts that day that the cold, commanding Duke waiting in that study would eventually become the man now watching her approach with tears of joy shining openly in his gray eyes, no longer hidden behind careful walls of composed distance. "You look beautiful," Alexander whispered as she finally reached him, taking both her hands in his own. "You look like a man who's finally stopped hiding," Alina whispered back, and the genuine, radiant smile that answered her words confirmed exactly how true her observation had become. They exchanged vows written entirely in their own words this time. No formal legal language, no careful clauses designed to protect either party from the other. Alina spoke of the man who had taught her that vulnerability was not weakness, that genuine partnership meant facing every crisis together rather than carrying burdens alone. Alexander spoke of the woman who had walked into his life through nothing more than a business necessity, and had somehow, through quiet strength and genuine kindness, taught him everything he had never known about what it truly meant to be loved for exactly who he was, rather than what he represented. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, this time bound not by contract, but by genuine, freely chosen love, the assembled guests erupted into joyful applause that echoed across the garden and up toward the tall windows of Wren Manor, the same windows Alexander had once watched from as Alina walked away after their very first meeting, uncertain then of what their strange arrangement might ultimately become. That evening, as the celebration continued beneath strings of soft lights hung throughout the garden, Alexander pulled Alina aside for a quiet moment away from the joyful noise of their guests, drawing her into a slow dance beneath the darkening spring sky. "Do you remember what I said to you that very first day in my study?" Alexander asked softly, his hand resting warmly against her waist as they swayed gently to music drifting from the reception nearby. "Sign and leave," Alina said with a small, knowing smile. "I remember it perfectly." "You signed without a single moment of hesitation," Alexander said, shaking his head slightly at the memory. "You left me completely speechless that day, more unsettled by your quiet composure than I had been by anything in years. I spent weeks afterward wondering what kind of woman could accept such a strange, significant arrangement with so little visible fear." "And now?" Alina asked, looking up at him with genuine curiosity. "Now I understand," Alexander said, his voice soft with wonder and love. "You weren't fearless that day, Alina. You were simply brave enough to choose hope over fear, even when hope seemed like the more difficult, more uncertain path. You've been teaching me that same lesson ever since, every single day." Alina rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the fine fabric of his wedding suit. Surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, married now not out of desperate necessity, but out of genuine, deeply chosen love. "I'm glad I signed that contract," she whispered. "So am I," Alexander murmured back, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head as they continued swaying together beneath the stars, the beginning of a future neither of them could have predicted on that cold morning, when a desperate young woman first walked through the iron gates of Wren Manor, carrying nothing but fear and hope in equal measure, and left, months later, having found something far more valuable than financial security. She had found a home, she had found genuine partnership, and most importantly, she had found a love that no contract could have ever truly created, one that had grown instead from patience, honesty, and the quiet courage to let down walls that both of them had once believed were permanent and unbreakable. A year later, the phone rang at 3 in the morning, and Alina was already reaching for it before the second ring finished echoing through their bedroom. "This is Alina Wren," she answered, her voice sharp with instant alertness, the calm competence she had built over months of managing crises alongside her husband settling immediately into place. "Ma'am, it's the estate manager," a tense voice said on the other end. "The rivers breached the lower bank near the village, water's rising fast. We've got families trapped in the low houses near the old mill, and the main road out is already flooding. Alina was out of bed within seconds, shaking Alexander awake as she reached for warm clothes in the darkness. "Alexander, wake up. The village is flooding. People are trapped." He was moving before she finished the sentence, years of crisis management instinct kicking in immediately. "Call Margaret. Get every able staff member up and organized. I want the estate's trucks and boats ready in 15 minutes. Alina, contact the district emergency line and tell them we need immediate coordination, not competition, for whatever resources are already heading this way." Within 20 minutes, Wren Manor had transformed from a quiet, sleeping estate into the heart of an emergency response effort. Staff moving with practiced urgency under Alexander's calm, decisive direction, while Alina coordinated with local authorities over the phone. Her sharp mind organizing supply lists and evacuation routes with the same precision she once brought to untangling financial records. The drive down toward the village felt endless, rain hammering against the windshield, while Alexander navigated roads rapidly disappearing beneath rising brown water. Alina sat beside him, radio in hand, relaying updates from the estate's small fleet of rescue boats already launching near the old mill, where the worst flooding had trapped several families in their homes. "There," Alexander said sharply, pointing toward a cluster of houses where water had already risen past the first-floor windows. A group of frightened villagers gathered on a rooftop, waving desperately toward the approaching lights of the estate's rescue boat. Alina felt her heart pounding as she watched the boat navigate carefully through the swirling current. Staff members she had come to know over the past year working with steady, practiced calm to bring the stranded families to safety one by one. An elderly woman was lifted carefully into the boat first, followed by a young family with 2 frightened children clinging tightly to their mother. "That's the Hendricks family," Alina said, recognizing them from the small village market she visited regularly. "Their little girl has asthma. We need to make sure the shelter has proper medical supplies ready." "Already arranged," Alexander said, glancing at her with quiet pride even in the chaos of the moment. "You radioed that information to the district coordinator 20 minutes ago. They're setting up a medical station at the community hall as we speak." Alina hadn't even realized she'd already handled it, her mind moving so quickly through the crisis that individual actions blurred together into a single continuous effort to keep everyone safe. It reminded her, in an odd way, of those early weeks poring over Harrington's financial records, the same intense focus, the same refusal to let fear slow down the necessary work in front of her. By dawn, the immediate danger had passed. The rain finally eased, and the emergency teams had successfully evacuated every family from the flooded lower village, bringing them to the warmth and safety of the community hall where volunteers, many of them Wren Manor staff, had set up hot food, dry blankets, and temporary sleeping arrangements for those who had lost access to their homes. Alina walked slowly through the crowded hall, checking on families she had come to know over the past year, offering quiet comfort to frightened children and exhausted parents alike. She found Alexander near the entrance, deep in conversation with the district emergency coordinator, his sleeves rolled up, mud splattered across his once immaculate clothing, looking nothing like the polished, distant Duke she had first met in his formal study nearly 2 years earlier. "How bad is it?" she asked, joining him as the coordinator moved off to handle another matter. "Bad enough," Alexander admitted, running a tired hand through his damp hair. "Several homes will need significant repair. Some may need to be rebuilt entirely, but everyone made it out safely, Alina, every single person." "Because you moved fast," Alina said, resting a hand gently against his arm. "Because you didn't hesitate for a single second once you understood what was happening." Alexander looked down at her, exhaustion evident in every line of his face, though something warm and grateful shone through despite the long, difficult night behind them. "We moved fast," he corrected gently. "This wasn't just me, Alina. It never is anymore." Over the following weeks, Alexander committed significant estate resources toward rebuilding the damaged sections of the village, working closely with local officials to ensure every displaced family received proper support during the difficult recovery process. Alina took charge of coordinating the practical details, her organizational skills proving just as valuable in disaster recovery as they had in dismantling Harrington's scheme or successfully defending their marriage before the panel of trustees. The village, once distant and largely unfamiliar to the family occupying the grand manor on the hill above it, grew steadily closer to the Wren household throughout the rebuilding process. Alina found herself genuinely welcomed wherever she went now, greeted not with the wary curiosity that had once followed her as a stranger from an unfamiliar world, but with the warm familiarity reserved for someone who had proven, through real action during a genuine crisis, exactly where her loyalties truly lay. One evening, several months after the flood, Alina and Alexander walked together through the newly rebuilt section of the village, admiring the sturdy new homes that had replaced the ones lost to the rising water. Children played happily in a small park the estate had funded as part of the recovery effort, their laughter carrying easily across the warm evening air. "It's strange," Alina said quietly, watching the joyful scene before them. "A year ago, I walked into your study as a stranger, terrified of everything my life was about to become. Now I can barely remember what it felt like not to belong here, not to care this deeply about every person in this village." "I feel the same way," Alexander admitted, taking her hand as they continued their slow walk through the rebuilt streets. "Though I suspect I have you to thank for most of that transformation. You taught me what it truly means to lead with genuine care, rather than distant obligation." They paused near the small park, watching the Hendricks girl, fully recovered from the frightening night of the flood, chasing her older brother in a joyful game across the fresh green grass. Alina felt a familiar warmth settle in her chest, the same quiet certainty she had felt on her wedding day, standing in that garden surrounded by everyone who mattered most to her. "I have something to tell you," Alina said softly, turning to face Alexander with a small, nervous smile. "You look nervous," Alexander observed, immediately attentive, his gray eyes studying her expression with careful concern. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Alina assured him quickly, her smile widening despite her lingering nerves. "I saw the doctor yesterday, Alexander. I'm pregnant." For a moment, Alexander simply stared at her, processing the news with an expression of pure, overwhelming joy that slowly broke across his entire face. "Alina," he breathed, pulling her gently into his arms, careful and tender in a way that made her heart swell with happiness. "Are you certain?" "Completely certain," Alina said, laughing softly against his chest as he held her close. "We're going to have a baby." Alexander pulled back slightly, his hands resting gently against her shoulders as he studied her face with an expression of wonder that reminded her powerfully of the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, that quiet evening in the library so long ago. "I love you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone, and now, somehow, that love just keeps growing even further." They stood together in the quiet park, surrounded by the sounds of children playing, of a village slowly healing and rebuilding, of a life neither of them could have imagined on that cold, formal morning, when Alina first signed a contract meant only to solve a legal problem. That single decision, made with quiet courage in a stranger's study, had grown into something neither of them had dared to hope for, a genuine partnership built on love, on shared crisis, on the steady, patient work of two people learning to trust each other completely. As they walked back toward the manor that evening, hand in hand beneath a sky slowly turning gold with the setting sun, Alina thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The desperate signature on a contract she barely understood, the cold distance of those first lonely weeks, the slow, careful warmth that had grown between them through shared crisis after shared crisis, each one drawing them closer together rather than pushing them apart. She thought about the frightened, uncertain woman who had walked through those iron gates so long ago, carrying nothing but fear and desperate hope, and the confident, deeply loved woman walking beside her husband now, carrying new life within her, secure in a love that had grown far beyond anything either of them had originally intended or expected. "Sign and leave," Alexander murmured suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence with a soft, remembering laugh. "I've never been more grateful for words I once meant so coldly." "Neither have I," Elena said, smiling up at him as they continued their peaceful walk home together, toward a future built not on contracts or obligations, but on genuine, unshakable love that had transformed both their lives completely, one honest moment at a time.